Creative Destruction and One Health, Policy, Science, and Practice in a Post-Normal World. First, let me say how grateful I am to have been invited to speak at this symposium, and in particular to speak in honor of Dr. Dirk Pfeiffer receiving the Carl Schwabe Award. Carl Schwabe has been a guiding light for me throughout much of my veterinary career. Wayne Martin, my own PhD supervisor, was his student, and after I graduated, Schwabe tried to lure me to UC Davis. I turned down the offer saying California was too hot and crowded for this Canadian prairie boy. I then went off to Indonesia for 2 years, which, as we all know, is not at all hot or crowded. But Schwabe's example of working internationally on problems that link human and animal health was a greater draw than being on the same faculty. Do what I do, not what I say, was the message I took away from this broad-minded, unabashedly curious humanist and global citizen. I'm also indebted to Dr. Schwabe for introducing me to Echinococcus granulosus, the tapeworm that causes Hydatid disease. For a decade, that parasite became my guru as I worked with colleagues in Nepal to find ways to curtail the disease there and understand what was occurring. So to Cal, to Dirk Pfeiffer, a fellow globally minded professional very much in the Schwabe tradition, and to the Association for Veterinary Epidemiology and Preventive Medicine, I say thank you. Well, let's begin by looking at a few of the basic concepts here. What is normal? I've had some messages recently. I've been looking around, a message from a laboratory saying, I am pleased to tell you that your test result is normal. Some things in newspapers, New York Times, will real estate ever be normal again? For COVID-19 long haulers, the new normal will be wildly different. Toronto Star, starting to feel a bit more normal around the Raptors, but a few more wins would help. CBC, critics say Canadian test mandate snarls normal border traffic. Xinhua, China's state grid says power supply back to normal. And as we all know in statistics, in a graph form, a normal distribution will appear as a bell curve. Well, that's all kind of ambiguous. So let's look at normal science. The philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, in The Structure of Scientific Revolution, defined normal scientific work as puzzle solving, the day-to-day research that scientists conduct in order to fill in the gaps in scientific knowledge that are found within the dominant paradigm. This work does not question or challenge the underlying assumptions of that paradigm. Each of us as scientists have been taught the rules of our disciplines and have been judged by our peers based on how well we have followed those rules. If we come across data that don't fit, we treat those as anomalies or outliers. And then if enough of these accumulate, the science goes through a revolutionary period, according to Kuhn, in which a new paradigm is created that hopefully explains the anomalies. His example was going from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics, but he generalized that to all sciences. So what's post-normal science? Post-normal science, if we look at this diagram to the right here, we start in the lower left corner and move outward. We're shifting our attention from curiosity-driven science in the bottom left corner, where our work is judged by our disciplinary peers, outward to applied science, where our questions are not so much driven by curiosity as by the needs of people who fund us and by our clients. Many of us are familiar with the next layer, which is professional consultancy, where the questions we ask are determined together with our clients, and where, because uncertainties abound, we make judgment calls based on probabilities and prior histories, and the stakes may be quite high, the death of an animal or the bankruptcy of a farm. Post-normal science was initially designed to address issue-driven questions relating to environmental debates, where typically facts are uncertain, values in dispute, stakes are high, and decisions are urgent. Here, the people with whom we are seeking answers are part of an extended peer community working together with experts and scientists to define the questions and evaluate answers. Many of us trained in normal science and professional consultancy have had some trepidation working with a scientific process that attempts to accommodate the chaotic crosscurrents and strong opinions of extended peer communities who deploy extended facts and take an active part in the solution of their problems. It makes us uncomfortable. The challenges of assuring quality control for post-normal scientists are an order of magnitude greater than what we have faced within the disciplinary normal science. Why would we do it then? If we're interested in grappling with the big questions of the day, such as biodiversity, climate change, pandemics, and One Health, this is the landscape into which we must venture. If we look at post-normal science and its relationship to policy, there was an article written by Peter Gluckman on the art of science advice to government. Peter Gluckman was the first science advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and he received the AAAS Award for Science Diplomacy and has done a lot of work in this particular area. In his comment in an article in the journal Nature was that I have come to understand that the primary functions and greatest challenges for a science advisor are providing advice not on a straightforward scientific matter, but instead on issues that have the hallmarks of what has been called post-normal science. These issues are urgent and of high public and political concern. The people involved hold strong opinions based on their values, and we all know that, those of us that have been involved in this, and the science is complex, incomplete, and uncertain. Diverse meanings and understandings of risks and trade-offs dominate. Well, let's step back a second now from these general statements and look at a specific example, one of Cal Schwabe's favorites, although he didn't talk about post-normal science, the parasitic cycle of echinococcosis, which I worked on in Nepal, and these pictures are from Nepal. So you have a tapeworm and a dog, another stage gets into the environment, it's consumed usually by a ruminant. The ruminant, the tapeworm forms a cyst inside the ruminant. The sheep or the goat or the buffalo is killed, and a dog eats the cyst and gets reinfected. If people get infected, we're a dead-end host, so we get a cyst, and it can be uncomfortable, or it can be much more serious than that and life-threatening. So this is a general life cycle. Often in normal science, we tend to simplify things. Well, we all do this as scientists. We do this every day. We simplify in different ways. In normal science and epidemiology, we tend to foster linear models, at least in the past. This is an extreme case, and I wouldn't put it in if it hadn't been in peer-reviewed literature. So, I mean, this is a legitimate model, right? So we go from the left, exogenous variables, and we go through pasture and sheep and rabbits, dogs, economics is in there between dogs and the prevalence in the dogs of the tapeworm. Well, that's an extreme linear model. The end result of linear modeling is it's basically all engineering. We're going in a line like this bridge here. And the solution to high data in Nepal was to build a new European style slaughterhouse. In fact, the Danes came in, they built a wonderful slaughterhouse. They said, if we get the butchers to work in here, we can contain it, we'll have proper hygiene, all of those kind of things. It didn't work. The butcher, for a whole variety of reasons, but a bottom line was that the butchers didn't want to go work in somebody else's factory. They had traditional family businesses that looked a bit like this on the left. It's really messy. It looks like this is a great chance for spreading disease around. Well, when I got there, I was working with Dr. Joshi and with Peter Shantz from CDC and various other people. We tried to get as much data as we could. We looked at what was infected, when were they infected, what butchering was happening, all of those kind of things. And then we developed public radio spots, workshops. We did all what we used to be called science communication in the old days when the experts got the data and then we told the public what was going on. Nothing changed. And I thought, well, I'm an epidemiologist. I'd like to have data, but I'd like to change the world for the better. What we did then was we went back to the community, with two communities. One of them had a communist government, one had a conservative government. And we said, okay, let's talk about what we would like to do here. What are your values? What would you like to achieve? We're concerned about this disease, but you have other concerns, clearly. After 5 years of community engagement, this is what exactly the same scene. They ended up putting in gardens, planting plants along the riverbank. They actually had composting. The water supply is not perfect, but it's better than it was before. How did this happen? I mean, community engagement, sure, that sounds great, but is this transferable? Is this a one-off thing that happened there? So some of us began to think about this. Is there some way to generalize this? One of the ways to think about this is in terms of a lazy 8 resilience model, which I call it creative destruction because a very similar model called creative destruction came out of economics, a guy called Schumpeter, who was trying to model cycles in business where we have all kinds of things going on here. And in an ecosystem, we might have different kinds of plants and animals and bacteria and so on. And then they begin to work together. You build up biomass, you have connections of various sorts, and you can do this in a business. And at some point it crashes because everything's overconnected. It becomes brittle. It doesn't have resilience. Then when it crashes, all these, the energy and so on is released. We've seen this in forests where we have fire coming through, it destroys all of the standing forest, but the seeds and the seedlings and all the other living things are there in order to create, to reorganize and start something new. What is that new thing? Well, it depends on who is there at the time of the crash, how they put things together. In this case, in community engagement, we had the butchers, the street sweepers, the politicians, the shopkeepers, and what they wanted to create was what we saw back here. And so that's what they did. They said, well, everything is falling apart. How can we make the whole thing new? And let me put this now into a context. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and there were waves of democracy around the world, a lot of enthusiasm. This has happened a few times over the last few decades. And including in Nepal, where there was a very over-connected, top-down, heavy bureaucratic system based on the king being at the top and all of his appointed bureaucrats. We had street demonstrations, and we also had a demographic shift. This was a young leader of the Butchers Association, and he's standing in the very place where in the first picture, you saw the woman and her children drinking water with the animals butchered in the background. What happened then was there was a global crash, and this crash was within that, and these people took advantage of it then in order to create something new. So that creative destruction works well if you've got the right people there. What happens if you have disruptions? Business people talk about disruptive interventions or disruptive technologies. And what if you scale that up and you just get destruction? So you've got tanks in the streets, you've got people in the streets, and instead of getting renewal, you have something else. It really depends on who's engaged at this inflection point between the crash and the renewal. And we know several countries, including USSR, where you didn't get the wave of democracy that everybody wanted. Similarly with Arab Spring and so on. So one important lesson there is if you see something crashing, run towards it, not away from it. Get engaged, help build something new. Here's another example of non-creative destruction. Life was completely disrupted and people were displaced by political violence in Liberia, in République de Guinée in the 90s and the early 2000s. There was civil war, a huge amount of destruction. People were moved around. They lost their livelihoods. They lost their homes. They died. After the war was over, billions of dollars of mining investments were brought in over the next decade, and more than half of Liberia's forests were sold off to industrial loggers. You say, well, this is money coming in, yes, but what it's doing is it's destroying more land, it's digging into the earth, it's destroying forests, and people are already displaced. So they're pushed into areas where they're not used to being, and they're eating foods which they may or may not have eaten before, but they're more dependent on it. And what happened was 2014 to 2016, 29,000 people sick with Ebola, 11,000 dead. A couple of years later, something similar in Democratic Republic of Congo near Virunga Park, where the guerrillas are protected. There were rebels fighting, and it was partly related to oil exploration coming into the area. So we have this dynamic. Who's there during the time of crash? And these mining investments, those are mines that were digging up things that we want for our computers and our technologies over here. So we're complicit in that. So that's the danger there. What if we scale this up? Now, I looked at this in terms of Ebola virus. I looked at it in terms of high data disease. Let's take the more general case, a linear, normal science view of health. I'm going to call health food, freedom from disease, and friends, which is my shorthand for social determinants of health. Back in 1600, Henry IV of France said, if God keeps me, I will make sure that no peasant in my realm will lack the means to have a chicken in the pot on Sunday. He didn't say they would all have chicken, but they would have the means to do so. He was assassinated a few years later by a fanatical Catholic who didn't think that Henry's conversion to Catholicism was sincere. He'd been a Protestant before, and he thought, well, I got to be a Catholic to be king. I'll become a Catholic. Apparently, that was not something he should have said in public. Somebody overheard him. A few decades later, we have René Descartes laying the foundations of what we now think of as normal science. Focus in, look at what's in front of you, and if you start getting all the little pieces and you put them together, you can understand everything. And René Descartes said that for by these scientific principles, I perceived it to be possible to render ourselves the lords and possessors of nature. Well, how did that work out? Well, it took a long time, but then post-World War, we had a lot of battles and disruptions and so on after that. But by the mid-20th century, we had been able to identify vitamins, proteins, genetics, all of these kind of things, and we could grow food really fast. Chickens went from about 4 billion in 1961 to 5 times that in 2015 or so. So huge amounts of increase, rapid increase, particularly in the 1980s. But this was built on long history of hard, painstaking science, normal science. Freedom from infectious disease. Now, one can argue about other kinds of diseases, but the original idea was to get rid of things like cholera, tuberculosis, and so on. And polio, and we had really strong declines in infectious diseases, combinations of changes in housing and food and drugs and foods, all those kinds of things. So that looks like a success. So we've got food, we've got freedom from disease. What about friends? Well, there are various surrogates for that. That's a hard thing to measure. World air travel and world air freight in the same time period as we saw the food increasing would indicate that there are a lot of people traveling and a lot of goods traveling. That's one possible indicator that, in fact, more wealth is being generated. This is a data-based diagram of international food trade networks in the early 21st century. What you can see, I don't expect you to understand what's going on here, but the point is that there is a lot of food and food components being traded around the world. That would seem to indicate that it's being shared on a global level. We'll explore that a little bit more. After this, the world begins to talk back. We have some complications and unexpected outcomes of that normal story of hardcore Cartesian science focusing in on things and generating food and vaccines and drugs and those kind of things. For one thing, the increasing animal production, we have world excrement production between 61 and 2013 from 8.5 billion tons of excrement to about 14 billion in 2013. What that also indicates is nutrients were being taken out of the ground in one part of the world, out of ecosystems, put through animals and dumped out in other parts of the world. So we're shifting nutrients and water to different parts of the world. So that's one thing to keep in mind. That's problematic, makes me a little worried. The wealth distribution, we saw, what looked like maybe at a global level, but if we look more closely, we find that the wealth has been very unevenly distributed. We have trillionaires wanting to fly off into space, and the rest of us are down here on Earth, and we're actually quite well off in North America. We have enough to eat and housing for the most part, but it's very unevenly distributed. Foodborne diseases, as the food system ramped up production and we had more and more food and it was more widely distributed, we also had increases in foodborne diseases. Because if you get a lot of animals together, they shed more. If you distribute it around the world, then you start shipping things around the world. This is England and Wales, but could have drawn similar graphs for the US, Canada, Europe, and various other countries where data are available. So we have that. And it's even a little bit more unsettling than that, because on the one hand, we have typhoid fever, which is one of the diseases we wanted to get rid of, dropping dramatically, but we have non-typhoidal salmonella increasing. And it really spiked in the late 80s, but we kind of leveled it off a bit, but it's still really high. On the left-hand side, we focus as veterinarians very hard on getting rid of Salmonella gallinarum, a serious disease of chickens. And there have been some studies done that indicate that the gallinarum filled an ecological niche in the intestines of chickens that was then filled by Enteritidis or Salmonella enterica, or whatever the name is right now. They keep shifting around. But a disease that's not serious in chickens, but is serious in people. So we've shifted around components of an ecosystem. We've gained some things, we've lost some things. Another part of this is before our success at producing more food, we could get the farmer, the butcher, and the animal rights activist all in the same picture, right? So, but then we look after success, where are all the people? Did the way we produced more food create social problems? There's nobody in here. And I've had colleagues from India say, we couldn't do this in parts of India because what would all the people do? What would we do for work? But if it's not a scientific problem, which we might argue, should scientists care? I mean, that's somebody else's problem, right? We're just here to increase food supplies. Maybe we can come up with some sort of parallel science and social science initiatives. We do have social determinants of health, and there's been a lot of work done on social determinants of health. Going back to, it goes back before Rudolf Virchow in 1848, but he's the one that's become best known. A medical pathologist was sent by the Prussian government to investigate the cause of a typhus epidemic in Upper Silesia. After intensive investigation, he submitted a report that recommended a program that included full employment, higher wages, the establishment of agricultural cooperatives, universal education, and the disestablishment of the Catholic Church. And we all know how well that went over, but he was looking at what the kinds of things that would show up in the Institute of Medicine's report on causes of emerging infectious diseases, as well as in a 2008 WHO report that looked at social determinants and concluded that social injustice is killing people on a grand scale, and recommended that governments work to improve daily conditions, including circumstances in which people are born, grow, live, and age, and tackle inequitable distribution of power, money, and resources. These are structural drivers of ill health. We also have ecological determinants of health, and there have been a variety of reports and studies: potable water, breathable air, a disease-free environment, adequate food, those kind of things, and how they tie into biodiversity and so on. A report by WHO in 2015 tried to bring these two together, connecting global priorities, biodiversity, and human health. And they began to be worried that we need to ensure that interventions made in the name of biodiversity, health, or other sectors do not compound the public health and conservation challenges. I want to address that worry because that's what we're facing now on a grand scale. And it's in part because of the way we've solved some of these other problems. There are many more than two perspectives on this situation. If you go over the literature in the last 30, 40, 50 years, you can find that livestock, insects, soybeans, GMOs, economies of scale, industrialization, pick your solution, are the sources of the world's worst environmental and climate problems, major drivers of emerging infectious diseases, the best solution to protein insufficiency, children do better in school, a way out of poverty for women raising small-scale livestock, improve childhood learning, a way to reinforce gender inequity because the men have the big businesses and the women are left in the backyard, a way to reinforce the power of multinational chemical agro industries of various sorts, a way to solve social problems with supposedly neutral agricultural technologies. And there are data to support and or refute each of these propositions. So what does evidence-based mean for One Health if we're trying to pull all this together? We have everything going on at the same time: childhood vaccinations, intensification, climate change, food, excrement problems, democracy movements, water scarcity, all of these things. And this is what's called a wicked problem, where you solve one thing and you create other problems. So you solve economic problems and you create health and environmental problems. You solve production problems the way you solve them, and then you create other kinds of problems. So it's not, you can't just separate them out into individual because they're all connected. And that's the issue. Does One Health help us here? Because One Health is holistic. It tries to pull things together. So what is One Health? There are many definitions out there, but one of them is any added value in terms of human, animal, and environmental health, sustainability, financial savings, social resilience, achievable by the transdisciplinary cooperation of human and veterinary medicine and the social and environmental sciences when compared to disciplines working independently. Now, this is really, you can't do this in a lab. This is post-normal science, if you want, in the extreme. Let's look at this then. What happens if we try to look at this in the real world? Well, all models, including creative destruction and resilience, including those that we look at for One Health, imply that there are boundaries and that there's a kind of stable baseline. We're trying to work within a system and we're trying to bring it to some sort of equilibrium. But what if the baselines have gone feral? They're wild, they're all over the place. And we've seen this with the climate change models, but also with biodiversity, with fire and flood and water. We've had those things in Canada, certainly in the last 6 months, and we've seen that around the world. It's not just here, it's just about everywhere. And then in the midst of that, if we look at this creative destruction model, what happens if one group hijacks One Health, which is trying to work at that intersection? The temptation, and I call it the Babel temptation, is to oversimplify and to declare, okay, here's the story. It's One Health, that's the story. René Descartes aspired to a goal where science would be the universal language. Now, in his case, that would be Latin spoken by white upper-class European men and their particular view of the world. There are some problems with that. And if you look now, there are more scholarly publications, each reflecting their own languages and dialects than there are spoken languages on the planet. So it's the Tower of Babel again, all over again, right? We were aspiring to this universal scientific language, a kind of Esperanto that everyone would understand. And we've collapsed back into academic and real world chaos. One Health Sans Frontières. Has One Health been hijacked? One of the ways I've come across this is to look at, there are questions that ask, how on earth can we feed 7, 8, or 9 billion people? But I ask, who are we? Who are the people, who's the blue bird behind the cafeteria desk there, and who are these open mouths on the other side? This, if we put it together in this way and we don't pay attention to power relationships, we end up with one world, one health, and then there's one solution. Maybe it's blockchains, maybe it's centralization of power and integrated vertical production. And we centralize power, and then what happens is we get pillaging from one part of the world and shifting manure resources from one part and it goes to another part, and it's all kind of obfuscates the heterogeneity and the injustices below the surface. So we have a kind of general one health, but specifically, a lot of people aren't doing very well. What happens if let's set aside the models, which have their boundaries. They're not the real world. We don't want to confuse the models with the real world. They're very useful. But what if we start thinking beyond systems and beyond models? Joshua Lederberg, who got the Nobel Prize for his studies on bacterial genetics, said that above all, science is bereft of deontology. It cannot tell why one should be interested in science or anything else. Deontology is a theory that suggests actions are good or bad according to a clear set of rules. It comes from the Greek word deon, and actions that obey these rules are ethical, while those that don't are not. But we don't have any ethical rules like that within science. We've got rules that say don't cheat, don't fake your data, those kind of things. But that's not what he's talking about here. He's saying we do all these scientific studies, but why? Why should we care? Science can't tell us why we should care. Tim Allen, who was on the Science Advisory Board for the Great Lakes Management and the cross-border management of the Great Lakes Basin, said that a science of intrinsic quality, we're looking for good quality science, needs narratives, it needs stories, and they have to have values, not just facts. We need to tie them together with certain kinds of values, especially as we deal with very complex situations. So not like in Dragnet, just facts, ma'am, I'm not interested in theories and so on, just the facts. Well, another thing Lederberg said was, biology is already so fact-laden, it is in danger of being bogged down awaiting advances in logic and linguistics to reach the integration of the particulars. We have so much data and we don't know how to put it together. We don't even have the language for it. We know a lot about things, and that's the heritage from Descartes, right? We can look at viruses and we can look at spike proteins on viruses and we can come up with a vaccine. We know a lot less about relationships among things, among viruses, bacteria, whole ranges of, all the way up to the globe. We have some sense recently about mycelia and how they communicate between trees and the earth. We know about gravity, of course, that's a way of tying things together. Chemical messengers, there have been a lot of studies in insects in particular, magnetism, the way birds or dung beetles will respond to magnetism or changes in the light. We have some of that, but we really don't understand that very well, so that when we mess around in the system, we can often create more trouble than we're trying to solve. The eco-social work, the world that we live in, exists in these relationships. We're not a bunch of individuals living on the planet. We are related to everything else. And this isn't some airy-fairy thing. This is real life. What we need is a post-normal paradigm and processes for constructive conflict, complex conversations, and quality control. How can we deal with a wide diversity of legitimate perspectives and values while maintaining quality? Quality is really tough to maintain. We need to address values. What's the value of a chicken? Working in Southeast Asia, on the left there at the top, those are competitive singing roosters in Java. They're worth a few thousand US each. These are not your usual backyard chicken. The chicken in the middle is being held by a little girl in Lao PDR, and that's her ticket to go to school, right? That's laying eggs, it's producing young ones, and they're sold. and it produces money for the household so the kids can go to school. On the right-hand side, there is a market girl in Ubon Ratchathani in southeastern Thailand. And I asked her, okay, you're selling commercial chickens and you're selling larger birds there, and you're selling backyard chickens. What can you tell me about the different values? Oh, she said the backyard chickens sell for twice as much per kilogram as the commercial chickens. WHO is saying, don't raise the backyard chickens because they spread disease. And she's saying, that's where the money is. What's the value of food? Well, if you upper left-hand corner there, we have a painting, a 16th century painting, Arcambaldo, which is basically says you are what you eat, right? Nutrition. In the extreme case, nutrition has taken us to nutraceuticals. You can put it in a pill. So that's another view of food. Or it's social. The Peasant's Wedding by Peter Bruegel in the lower right-hand corner there. It's a social thing. In the middle at the bottom, I was involved in assessing animal healthcare facilities in Cambodia, a cross-cultural communication thing. What are you eating? Where does that come from? And the lower left corner, the butchers in Kathmandu, it's a family tradition. We're all part of that. What's the value of excrement, of manure? Well, in the upper left-hand corner there, we have one of the things that the butchers did in Kathmandu after they began working together with everybody else in the community. They're composting, and the ducks can get insects there, and so they can have a kind of a multi-use thing where before it was just contamination. That's Peter Shantz from Centers for Disease Control. He's standing next to a wall covered with manure, which is fuel, burns very cleanly. Anaerobic biodigesters at the bottom there. To generate energy. There's been a lot of work done on that. And it's also, the lower right-hand corner, it's a threat. I mean, the reason we have some of the infrastructure we've got now is because we were getting rid of cholera, typhoid, some of these waterborne diseases. There is still danger there, but these are different kinds of values, and how do we begin to work with those different values? What's the value of a dog? Upper left-hand corner, could be rabid. Lower left-hand corner, that's in Kathmandu. That dog is being celebrated. Upper right-hand corner, those dogs are community police. They're guarding a small temple there, but they also patrol the neighborhood, and they're very strict about they don't cross that street because that's somebody else's territory. This is our territory. So you don't have paid police, but you've got dogs who are patrolling. We've got dogs here who are their comfort in the hospital, but it's a bit of a risk if you're in an ICU hooked up into an IV and you've got a dog in your lap. Or pets at home, wonderful companions for little kids. But if the little kid gets his face into the dog dish, there are also dangers there, salmonella and so on. What's the value of wildlife? We don't even know all the wildlife that's out there. Bats, we're worried about bats because they're carrying something, but they're carrying seeds, they're carrying pollen, they're doing all kinds of things in ecosystems that are really important. A deer in the lower left corner, apparently they carry a lot of COVID, and Lyme disease and various other things. We've got ticks, we've got mice, we've got cranes, we've got sandhill cranes. We've got a whole range of different wildlife, and they all have different roles in the environment. How do we evaluate that? So we are having these conversations among people. Which people? Well, is that politically determined? Is it linguistically determined? So we have challenges with languages there, and scientific language helps a bit, but it doesn't cross over into everyday language. And I found that when I was studying people who were eating insects, that Aborigines in Australia had certain names for bugs that they were eating, and Western scientists didn't have a clue what those were, and they tried to give them scientific names, and so we were trying to balance that. Megafauna, which ones? Prey, predators, the ugly ones, the cute ones. Tree communities, which ones? Almonds require a lot of spraying, huge amounts of water, more than Los Angeles and San Francisco. A lot of bees die there. Castaña, Brazil nuts, that's this one on the lower right-hand corner here. They require certain kinds of orchids growing on them, which attract certain kind of bees, which attract other things, and then that's how they get pollinated. Mini and micro livestock, which ones? Bees, it's my son and his daughter in Australia, they're raising bees. Maggots, Triatominae, which carry Trypanosoma cruzi. Locusts, are they good, bad? Are locusts like cattle? They graze on pasture and we can eat them, or are they destroying our crops? Microbiomes. We like some microbiomes, we use them for gut replacements to help cure C. difficile infections. But there are what about other microbiomes? What about microbiomes on food, microbiomes on landscapes? How do we begin to be parts of these conversations to study them? Who decides which ones we pick? There's a whole other layer of conversations there. And how do we do that? We're trying to assess multiple sources of information in terms of quality control. And what we need is peripheral vision. We can't all see everything all the time. The dilemma is that our scientific and technological successes, the big ones, have relied on our ability to focus right down, spike protein on the virus. But in the process, we have generally lost our peripheral vision. We're like a horse with blinders on. You can get there more efficiently, run the race, but you stumble into things unless there's somebody outside steering the ship, and not sure that we want to have somebody steering our ship. Each of us cannot see everything, so we must be each other's peripheral vision. I can't see everything, so I collaborate with a whole range of different organizations and disciplines, cultures. Unless we do that, we will always be blindsided. And there's another layer here. I've been talking about kind of physical survival and thriving, but survival is not enough, as they said in Star Trek and a few other places. The Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, this I know at great cost, all life is not outward, food, drink, and so on, nor is all death from within. So some of the life is outward. You can get shot and starve to death. And Emily Yates-Doerr is an anthropologist who looked at scientists who were studying in Wageningen, who were studying insects as a source of food for the world food supply. And they had a very specific way of thinking about insects. And her conclusion was, to impact the food supply of the world, it is necessary to attend to many different worlds. And that's our best hope for moving forward. The future is uncertain. We have agency. We can make good decisions. We just have to be brave and imagine a different future and go there. Thank you.